The air inside the courtroom was thick with the kind of judgment that couldn't be spoken but was felt in every glance, every whisper, every slight shift of discomfort in the wooden pews. The room was full, yet it felt as though all the space had been sucked out, leaving behind only the weight of silent condemnation. At the center of it all stood a woman, shackled at the wrists, her once tight curls now tangled and matted, her clothes stained with the grime of the streets. She stood still, shoulders squared, though every eye in the room bore down on her as if she were something less than human, something to be discarded, something undeserving of even the most basic dignity. The uniformed man standing beside her, a towering figure with a sneer carved deep into his face, clutched a pair of clippers in one hand, turning them over for the crowd to see, letting the metallic hum cut through the tense silence like a slow, dragging blade. His smile stretched wider, an expression of pure, unfiltered cruelty, as he stepped forward, his boots heavy against the cold tile floor. He gripped a handful of her thick, coiled hair, tugging it just enough to make her head jerk backward. The courtroom watched in eerie silence, some faces twisted in quiet approval, others looking away, unwilling to intervene. "You don't belong here," he said, his voice dripping with disdain, his fingers tightening in her hair before finally letting it drop. He tilted his head, pretending to inspect her like a filthy object he'd found on the ground. "You think you can just walk around this city like a normal citizen? Like you matter?" His lips curled, his grip on the clippers tightening. "You're filth. A disgrace. A stain." The woman remained silent, her expression unreadable. She didn't flinch. Didn't pull away. She simply watched. And for some reason, that only seemed to fuel his need to break her. A flick of his thumb, and the buzzing of the clippers filled the room. He raised them high, so the audience could see. A sick display. A lesson. He wanted everyone to remember this moment. A slow, heavy silence draped itself over the room, thick and suffocating. No one stopped him. No one spoke. Not the judge, seated above them with an air of detached indifference, adjusting his glasses as if none of this concerned him. Not the officers stationed near the exits, their expressions blank, their hands still on their belts. Not the court clerks, their pens frozen above their notepads. And then, without hesitation, he pressed the clippers against her scalp. The first pass was brutal. The sound of her hair being shorn off was a cruel, grating noise that echoed across the courtroom. Thick, dark curls tumbled to the floor in lifeless heaps. The officer worked slowly, deliberately, taking his time with each pass of the razor, letting the strands drift down like fallen leaves. With every stroke, the humiliation deepened. The laughter began, a low chuckle from somewhere in the back, spreading like wildfire through the room. Someone whispered something to their neighbor. A snicker. A smirk. A shift in the judge's expression, the slightest twitch of amusement that he didn't bother to hide. The officer leaned in, the heat of his breath ghosting over her exposed scalp. "Take a good look, folks," he said, his voice triumphant, eyes scanning the crowd. "This is what happens when they step out of line. No respect. No place in this society. No future." His words hung heavy in the air, sinking into the moment like a dagger being twisted. The humiliation was complete. It was done. He stepped back, admiring his work, arms crossed over his chest. She was supposed to cry. To break. To beg. But she didn't. Instead, she did something no one in that room expected. She lifted her chin. The raw, exposed skin of her scalp caught the courtroom light, but it wasn't shame or defeat that burned in her eyes. It was something else. Something colder. Sharper. Something that, for the first time since this sick spectacle had begun, made the officer's grin falter. She scanned the room slowly, deliberately, her gaze sweeping across every face, pausing on the judge, on the clerks, on the spectators who had watched and done nothing. Letting them feel the weight of their complicity. Letting them understand that something had shifted. And then, with a voice as steady as stone, she spoke. You just made the biggest mistake of your life." A ripple of unease spread through the courtroom. The laughter stopped. A few heads turned, glancing toward the judge as if waiting for him to intervene, but he said nothing. The officer snorted, shaking his head like she was nothing more than an insect buzzing in his ear. But there was something in her voice, something that didn't sit right. She wasn't angry. She wasn't afraid. She was in control. The atmosphere shifted, something unspoken crackling beneath the surface. She wasn't pleading, wasn't grasping for sympathy. She was making a statement. A warning. And then, she turned. She looked past the officer. Past the judge. Past the courtroom full of faces suddenly unsure of what they had just witnessed. Her eyes locked onto the back of the room, where a lone figure stood against the far wall. A man in a dark suit, silent and motionless. He didn't speak. He didn't move. But then, he nodded. And in the next instant, the courtroom erupted. The heavy double doors at the back flew open, slamming against the walls. The sharp clatter of boots echoed through the chamber as figures in black suits stormed in, weapons drawn, voices barking commands. The judge barely had time to react before the flood of federal agents filled the space, their presence swallowing every inch of authority the officer thought he had. Federal agents. Hands where we can see them. Panic rippled through the room. The spectators recoiled, murmurs turning to shouts, confusion twisting into chaos. The officer staggered back, his hand instinctively reaching for his weapon, but he barely had time to process what was happening before he found himself staring down the barrels of at least 5 guns. The woman did not move. She did not speak. She simply watched as the world around her turned inside out. Because she was no homeless woman. No helpless victim. She was something else entirely. And the man who had just humiliated her. The one who had laughed, who had stripped away her dignity like it was nothing. He was about to learn the true meaning of justice. But the real question was, how far would karma go to make him pay? Before we begin this powerful story, we want to take a moment to speak directly to our black viewers. Here at Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against racism, discrimination, and injustice in any form. Your voice matters. Your story matters. And we believe in the power of truth, justice, and resilience. This story is more than just a twist, it's a message. A reminder that karma always finds its way. Now, sit back and enjoy the story. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our jaw-dropping stories. Plow of Twist, because every story deserves a reckoning. Enjoy the story. The city of Atlanta was a place of contrast, a skyline that sparkled with glass towers and luxury, while its streets told a different story. The divide between wealth and struggle was stark, and if you paid attention, you could see it in every corner. Downtown was a hub of movement, corporate elites walking with purpose, students clutching their books, tourists marveling at the civil rights landmarks, but just a few blocks away, under the overpasses and in the alleyways, the forgotten lived. Some called them drifters, others used harsher words. The city had policies, shelters, outreach programs, but in the end, survival was an individual fight. Ayanna Parker knew that fight all too well. To the world, she was just another homeless black woman, sitting on a crumbling sidewalk, wrapped in layers of old, mismatched clothes. Her dark skin, dusted with grime, made her invisible to those who passed by. People avoided eye contact, crossed the street, clutched their bags tighter. Assumptions followed her like shadows: criminal, addict, unstable. Few people ever stopped to ask, few cared to know who she was beyond the sight of her tattered clothes and unkempt hair. That was the thing about society, once they decided what you were, nothing else mattered. She had been living on the streets for months now, drifting from one part of the city to another, never staying too long in one place. The homeless shelters were overcrowded, the public bathrooms barely maintained, and the people, desperate, broken, angry, sometimes posed a bigger threat than the cold or hunger. She knew how to survive. She had learned when to keep quiet, when to disappear, when to fight. But today, none of those instincts mattered. Because today, everything went wrong. She had only wanted something to eat. It wasn't a crime to be hungry. The supermarket on Auburn Avenue was a place she had been before, one of those small, locally owned places, where the cashiers barely acknowledged her existence. She had been careful. She always was. But the store manager, a middle-aged white man with tired eyes and a permanent frown, had noticed her the moment she stepped inside. She could feel his stare as she moved through the aisles, pretending to browse like any regular customer, even though she had no money. The sandwich had been small. Just a pre-packaged, plastic-wrapped thing, nothing expensive. Her stomach ached, a dull pain that had become a constant companion over the weeks. She had waited for the right moment, slipped it into the oversized pocket of her coat, and turned toward the door. But before she could take another step, a hand grabbed her wrist, tight, rough, unforgiving. "Think I didn't see that?" the manager had barked, yanking her back. Instinct kicked in. She jerked away, tried to run, but another employee had already blocked the exit. The scuffle was brief, but enough to attract attention. Someone called the cops. Within minutes, they arrived, 2 officers, one younger, seemingly indifferent, the other older, broader, with a presence that demanded obedience. And that's when she met Officer Daniel Briggs. Briggs wasn't just a cop, he was the kind of cop who believed in making examples out of people like her. His uniform was crisp, his belt weighed down with authority, and his eyes carried something colder than the badge on his chest. He took one look at her, her clothes, her skin, her silence, and she could see it in his face, contempt. He didn't see a person. He saw a problem. "Let me guess," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "You didn't mean to steal, huh? Just slipped in your pocket by accident?" She didn't answer. She had learned long ago that words didn't change minds like his. Briggs didn't like that. Didn't like that she didn't cower, didn't beg, didn't cry. He wanted submission. He wanted fear. "Turn around," he ordered. "Hands behind your back." The cold bite of metal against her wrists was nothing new, but what happened next was. Instead of simply escorting her out, instead of following protocol, Briggs had yanked her forward, dragging her outside, making sure every customer saw. He had paraded her through the parking lot, past people who clutched their children closer, past shoppers who stared but said nothing. And then, he had pushed her down, hard, against the hood of his car. "Got yourself an audience now," he murmured near her ear. "Guess you should have thought twice before acting like an animal." The words should have burned, should have shattered her, but she had already endured worse. Still, this wasn't over. Briggs wasn't just taking her to the station. He wasn't interested in just an arrest. No, he had bigger plans. A few hours later, Ayanna found herself standing in a packed courtroom, her wrists still bound, her stomach still empty, her hair still wild. But now, all eyes were on her. Briggs had made sure of it. The judge barely looked up from his desk, flipping through papers like this was just another case, another nameless, faceless person being processed through the system. The prosecutor spoke in detached legalese, listing charges like she wasn't even in the room. But Briggs? He was enjoying this. Standing beside her, uniform gleaming, he turned to the judge with a smirk. "Your Honor," he said, voice smooth and confident, "before we proceed, I think it's only right that we clean up the courtroom a little. Can't have people thinking we let just anyone stand here looking like this." She felt it before she saw it, the movement of his hand reaching into his pocket, the unmistakable buzz of clippers coming to life. A murmur rippled through the room. Even the judge hesitated, momentarily caught off guard. But no one stopped him. No one told him he had crossed a line. No one said a word as he grabbed a fistful of her hair and pressed the razor against her scalp. The first pass was merciless. Her thick, coiled strands tumbled to the cold floor, stripped away in uneven, jagged patches. The courtroom watched in silence, some with amusement, some with indifference, but no one intervened. Briggs leaned in close, his voice a low whisper meant only for her. "Now the whole world can see you for what you really are." Laughter broke out. The smirks grew wider. The room became a stage, and she was the punchline to a joke she never agreed to be part of. But Ayanna did not cry. She did not beg. She did not break. She simply lifted her chin, met Briggs' eyes, and whispered words that would change everything. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." The courtroom had not been designed for comfort. It was sterile, cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature but rather the absence of warmth, of care, of humanity. The wooden benches were old, their surfaces scratched and worn from years of restless hands gripping them tightly during sentencing, from tired bodies leaning forward in anticipation or despair. The walls were plain, off-white, void of any real character, a perfect reflection of the system it housed, functional, indifferent, and utterly devoid of emotion. And yet, the room was full of people. Some were there because they had to be, court employees, officers, lawyers moving mechanically through their routines. Others were there because they wanted to be, spectators who had stumbled in for the daily display of justice, or more accurately, punishment. It was a cycle, predictable in its cruelty, a performance where the ending had already been written long before the curtain had even risen. In the center of it all stood Ayanna Parker. She was not like the others who had been paraded through this courtroom before her. Not because she was special in the way society often defined it, but because she carried herself differently. She had no desperate, pleading eyes, no hunched shoulders of submission, no trembling lips of regret. She stood straight, her wrists bound in front of her, her head, now stripped bare of its thick, coiled crown, held high. But there was something else. Something that hadn't quite settled in the air yet. Something unsaid, unspoken, but felt by those who paid attention. The laughter that had filled the room moments earlier had quieted, but its remnant still lingered in the smug expressions, the approving nods exchanged between men who saw nothing wrong with what had just happened. Officer Daniel Briggs stood among them, his uniform crisp, his stance relaxed in the way of someone who knew, with absolute certainty, that he was untouchable. His arms were crossed over his chest, a smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth as he watched Ayanna, as if waiting for her to break, to collapse under the weight of her own humiliation. But she didn't. Instead, she held his gaze. And that was the moment when something in Briggs twitched. It was almost imperceptible, a slight shift in his stance, a flicker in his expression so brief it could have been imagined. But it was there. Because she wasn't reacting the way she was supposed to. She should have been shaken. She should have been begging for mercy, for leniency, for anything to make the torment stop. But Ayanna didn't flinch. Didn't cower. Didn't even blink. Briggs narrowed his eyes, straightening his shoulders, as if resetting himself, as if reminding himself who he was and who she was supposed to be. The judge finally cleared his throat, pushing his glasses up the bridge of his nose, barely giving the scene a passing glance before shuffling through the documents in front of him. He spoke in the tired, disinterested tone of a man who had seen too much, cared too little, and processed too many cases to remember any of them by the time he left the courthouse each evening. "Officer Briggs," the judge muttered, eyes still scanning his paperwork, "I assume that concludes your demonstration." Briggs let out a small chuckle, rolling his shoulders back with the confidence of someone who knew there would be no consequences, no reprimand, not even a word of warning. "Just doing my part to ensure the dignity of this courtroom, Your Honor. Can't have certain elements making a mockery of the judicial system." A few scattered chuckles echoed through the room. The prosecutor, a man with a sharp suit but dull eyes, merely adjusted his tie and remained silent. The clerks, too, pretended they hadn't heard, that nothing had happened, that this was just another ordinary day. But Ayanna spoke then. And when she did, it was not with the voice of a woman broken by the system. It was something else entirely. You just made the biggest mistake of your life. Her words weren't loud, yet somehow they carried through the courtroom, settling into the air like a storm waiting to break. Briggs' smirk twitched, faltered for a fraction of a second, but he quickly masked it with an exaggerated scoff, shaking his head. Still got a mouth on you, huh? You'd think you'd know when to keep quiet. Ayanna's eyes didn't waver. You'd think you'd know when you've gone too far. Briggs opened his mouth to respond, but for some reason, the words didn't come. Because now, he was beginning to feel it. Something was off. Something about the way she was looking at him. Something about the way the energy in the room had shifted. The judge exhaled through his nose, his patience thinning. Enough. Let's move forward. What are the charges? The prosecutor finally stood, his expression carefully neutral, as though he had just now remembered his job. Your Honor, the defendant was apprehended for stealing food from a local grocery store. The store owner has chosen to press charges. Given her record, Ayanna's voice cut in, sharp as a blade. What record? The prosecutor hesitated, caught off guard by her tone. Ayanna turned her gaze on him now, and for the first time, he looked uncomfortable. Go ahead, she said. Tell me. What record do I have? The times I was arrested for sitting in the wrong place. For walking at the wrong hour. For existing in a way that made people like you uncomfortable. A long silence stretched through the courtroom. The prosecutor cleared his throat, glancing quickly at the judge before lowering his gaze back to his papers. Briggs, however, had no patience for hesitation. Look, let's not make this more complicated than it needs to be. She stole, she got caught, she gets locked up for a while, end of story. Ayanna tilted her head slightly. Is that what you think this is? The end? Briggs narrowed his eyes, the smirk on his face faltering again, just for a second. You don't get it, do you? He took a slow step toward her, voice lowering. This ain't a movie. There's no twist coming. There's no big rescue. You're done. Ayanna didn't move, didn't blink. But her silence said more than words ever could. And something about it crawled under Briggs' skin in a way he couldn't quite place. The judge sighed again, rubbing his temples as though weary of the entire exchange. The court will take a short recess before final sentencing. Officer Briggs, you may escort the defendant to holding. Briggs grinned, stepping toward her, reaching for her arm. Gladly. But Ayanna did not resist. Because she knew something he didn't. She knew that outside this courthouse, something had already begun. She knew that this was not the end of the story. No. This was only the beginning. The door to the holding room slammed shut behind Ayanna, the sound echoing through the small, windowless space. The air inside was thick, stale, pressing against her skin like an unseen weight. A single overhead light flickered slightly, casting shadows along the walls, the kind that made the room feel even smaller than it already was. Across from her, Daniel Briggs stood near the doorway, arms crossed, his posture exuding that same arrogance he had carried since the moment he laid eyes on her. There was a smirk playing at the edges of his lips, a cruel satisfaction in the way he looked at her, as if he had already won, as if there was no possible way this could end in anything other than her complete and utter defeat. Briggs let out a slow exhale, shaking his head like a parent dealing with a disobedient child. You must really think you're somebody, don't you? His voice was casual, almost amused. The way you carry yourself, the way you talk, acting like you got something up your sleeve. I've seen plenty like you, and let me tell you something, none of them ever end up anywhere but exactly where they belong. Right here. Locked up. Forgotten. Ayanna didn't move. She didn't flinch. She just sat there, her hands resting lightly on her lap, her head slightly tilted, her gaze steady. That same unsettling calmness that had been there in the courtroom was still present, still lingering in the air between them, thickening the space like an invisible fog. She wasn't reacting the way he expected, and he didn't like it. Briggs chuckled, running a hand over his jaw before stepping forward, leaning slightly toward her. "You still think someone's coming for you? That's what this is? You really believe that?" He let out a low laugh, shaking his head. "Sweetheart, let me tell you something about the real world. Ain't nobody coming. You're just another nobody, a waste of space, another mouth society don't need to feed. I could walk out of here right now, leave you in this cell for weeks, and not a damn person would give a shit." For a long moment, Ayanna said nothing. The silence stretched between them, and Briggs started to shift, just slightly, like he could feel something moving just beyond his reach, something he hadn't accounted for. And then, finally, she spoke. "You really think you understand the world, don't you?" Her voice was soft, but there was something beneath it, something steady, something that made the air feel heavier than it had a moment ago. "You think power is holding someone down. That control is making someone afraid of you. You measure yourself by the fear you put in others, by how small you can make them feel. And maybe that worked for you before. Maybe it's worked for years. But today, Officer Briggs," her lips barely parted as she spoke the next words, slow and deliberate, "you are going to learn what it feels like to be small." Briggs blinked. Just once. But it was enough. There was a loud, sudden knock at the door behind him. Not the casual kind. Not the kind that asked permission. The kind that demanded entry. Briggs straightened instantly, turning toward the door with a frown, his hand instinctively resting on his belt. What the hell? The door swung open. And then the room was full. Two men in dark suits entered first, moving with the kind of quiet authority that spoke louder than any badge or uniform Briggs had ever worn. Their faces were unreadable, their presence undeniable. Behind them, a third man stepped in, older, distinguished, the kind of man whose silence carried more weight than most people's words. His gaze swept across the room, landed on Ayanna, and in an instant, everything changed. Briggs took a step back, his mouth opening slightly, then closing again, as if his brain was trying to catch up with what his instincts had already recognized. These were not local cops. These were not city officials. These were federal agents. Briggs swallowed, forcing his voice to stay even. Can I help you gentlemen?" The older man barely spared him a glance before stepping past him, his eyes fixed solely on Ayanna. And then, to Briggs' absolute horror, the man nodded at her. Not in acknowledgement. Not in dismissal. In respect. And that's when it happened. Ayanna Parker, the woman Briggs had paraded through the courtroom like a spectacle, the woman he had humiliated, degraded, laughed at, stripped down to nothing in front of an entire crowd, stood up. Not as a prisoner. Not as a victim. But as something else entirely. The air in the room shifted, the balance of power tilted, and Briggs felt the first real chill of something he had never felt before in his entire career. Fear. Ayanna stepped forward, slow and deliberate, her eyes locking onto his, and for the first time, he saw it. She was not homeless. She was not helpless. She was not the nobody he had convinced himself she was. She was something else entirely. The older man, Deputy Director Michael Graves of the CIA, spoke, his voice smooth, unwavering, carrying the weight of authority that Briggs had never possessed, never would possess, no matter how many people he tried to tear down. "Ms. Parker," Graves said, his expression calm, professional. "Are you ready?" Ayanna nodded once. "I am." And then, she turned to Briggs, her expression still unreadable, still composed, but there was something else now. Something undeniable. "Officer Briggs," she said, and he hated how his name sounded in her mouth now, how different it felt when she was the one saying it, when she was the one looking down at him. "This is the part where you start understanding exactly how deep you've buried yourself." Briggs' mouth went dry. The other agents stepped forward, and that's when Briggs finally saw it, the identification badge clipped to the inside of Ayanna's coat, the insignia of the Central Intelligence Agency staring him in the face like a ghost come back to haunt him. His stomach dropped. What the hell is this? He stammered, the confidence gone from his voice now, replaced by something else entirely. Graves turned to him then, his expression finally settling into something colder, something unforgiving. "Officer Daniel Briggs," he said, his voice the sound of a coffin lid slamming shut, "you are under federal investigation for gross misconduct, abuse of power, and obstruction of a covert intelligence operation." Briggs took another step back, panic creeping into his veins like poison. This is bullshit, you think you've been the one watching her?" Graves' voice cut through the air like a blade. "She's been watching you." And in that moment, for the first time in his entire life, Briggs realized what it meant to be powerless. Briggs felt his chest tighten, the weight of the moment pressing down on him like a vice. The room around him seemed to shrink, the fluorescent light overhead flickering slightly, casting sharp shadows that made everything feel more suffocating. His mouth was dry, his pulse hammering against his ribs as the realization settled in, this wasn't a joke, this wasn't a mistake, this was real. His eyes darted between the men in suits, the ones standing like immovable statues, their expressions unreadable, their presence absolute. His gaze snapped back to Ayanna, and for the first time, he saw her for what she truly was, not a victim, not a nobody, but someone who had been playing a game he never even knew existed. His voice came out uneven, cracked at the edges. You can't be serious. This is some kind of setup, right?" His breath was coming too fast now, his hands shaking slightly despite the forced confidence in his stance. "You're telling me she's, what? Some kind of agent? That's bullshit." Ayanna didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even blink. She simply stood there, steady, composed, completely untouched by his unraveling. "Do I look like I'm joking?" Briggs' nostrils flared as he tried to regain his footing, tried to push back against the creeping sensation that his world was slipping out from under him. He turned to Graves, desperate now, grasping for something, anything, to explain this away. "This can't be legal. You don't have jurisdiction here. This is a state matter, she was arrested for theft, for vagrancy, I was just doing my job." Graves barely tilted his head, his expression cool, detached. "Is that what you were doing? Your job?" He reached into his inner jacket pocket and pulled out a folder, flipping it open with quiet precision. "Because according to these reports, Officer Briggs, your job description seems to include unlawful detainment, excessive use of force, and a disturbing pattern of targeting specific demographics, namely, black citizens in low-income areas." He paused, his gaze sharp as a scalpel as he studied the man in front of him. "Tell me, does that sound like standard police work to you?" Briggs' stomach turned. "I don't know what the hell you're talking about." Graves didn't let him finish. He held up a photograph, a grainy image of Briggs from a body cam recording, his hand gripping the back of a young black man's neck, shoving him onto the pavement. The timestamp in the corner was recent, too recent. "You were warned about this months ago. Internal Affairs flagged your behavior, yet nothing changed. It seems you're under the impression that certain rules don't apply to you." Briggs' mind raced, his vision narrowing. He remembered that night. Remembered how the kid had struggled, how he had pressed his knee down just a little harder than necessary to shut him up. But he had been careful. Hadn't he? His voice was tighter now, less sure. IA reviewed those incidents. They didn't find anything conclusive. If they had, I wouldn't still have my badge." Graves let out a breath, almost amused. "Oh, Officer Briggs. You still think this is about your badge?" He leaned forward just slightly, lowering his voice. "You should be more concerned about your freedom." Briggs froze. A slow chill crawled up his spine. He had expected maybe a suspension, maybe a forced resignation. He had never once considered prison. His body tensed, years of muscle memory urging him to fight back, to take control, to flip the situation in his favor. He had done it before, twisted reality to fit his version of events, and it had always worked. But not this time. Because this time, the room wasn't full of people who feared him. It was full of people who had already dismantled him before he even realized the game had started. Ayanna stepped forward, closing the distance between them. Her presence was deliberate, her energy unshakable. Briggs had seen plenty of confident people before, cocky criminals, lawyers who thought they could out-talk him, even fellow officers who carried their authority like a shield. But Ayanna? She wasn't posturing. She was simply telling the truth. Her voice was calm, but there was iron beneath the surface. You didn't just humiliate me in that courtroom today. You exposed yourself. You showed the world exactly who you are, and now, the world is watching. Briggs clenched his jaw, sweat forming at the base of his neck. You set me up. Ayanna lifted a brow. Did I? Briggs' breathing grew uneven. He could feel the walls closing in, the inevitability of it all wrapping around his throat like a tightening noose. His mind clawed for a way out. This is federal overreach. You can't just come in here and override local authority. You don't have the power. Graves raised a single hand, signaling to one of the agents standing by the door. The man nodded, pulling out a phone, pressing a single button before stepping forward and handing it to Briggs. The screen lit up. A live broadcast. Briggs' pulse spiked. His stomach churned as he saw it, his face, on every major news network. The footage from the courtroom, his voice sneering as he held those clippers, the crowd's laughter, the way Ayanna's hair had fallen to the floor in uneven chunks. It was everywhere now. The entire country had seen it. His world imploded. His fingers tightened around the phone, his grip so tense it trembled slightly. He could hear the news anchor's voice, crisp, merciless. Outrage has erupted nationwide following the release of disturbing footage showing Officer Daniel Briggs forcibly shaving the head of a black woman inside a courtroom. Civil rights leaders are calling for immediate action. Briggs threw the phone away from him as if it burned, his breath coming fast, uneven. His vision tunneled. His career was over. His reputation destroyed. And yet, the worst had yet to come. Graves adjusted his tie before speaking again, his voice steady, professional. Your department has officially relieved you of duty, effective immediately. The district attorney's office has already begun proceedings against you. And given the nature of these charges, he tilted his head slightly, his eyes darkening just a fraction, I'd recommend securing legal counsel. Immediately. Briggs' hands shook. His chest tightened. His entire life, he had held power over others. He had controlled their fates. But now, he was the one being sentenced. And the worst part? Ayanna Parker didn't even need to lift a finger. She had already won. The weight of the moment settled over the room like a heavy fog, thick and suffocating. The power dynamic had shifted so violently, so irreversibly, that it left Briggs standing there, frozen, grasping for something, anything, to hold on to. His breath was uneven, his hands clenched at his sides, his mind scrambling to find a way out of a situation that had already spiraled too far beyond his control. The feeling was foreign to him, this complete lack of authority, this sudden realization that he was no longer the one calling the shots. He had spent years wielding power, using his badge as a weapon, convincing himself that he was untouchable. But now, standing in front of Ayanna Parker, standing in front of the woman he had tried to break, he felt something he had never truly felt before. Fear. Graves didn't move, didn't blink, didn't flinch. The authority in his presence was effortless, absolute. He wasn't just a man in a suit, he was the reckoning Briggs had never seen coming. His voice, steady and unshaken, cut through the silence like a blade. You had every opportunity to walk away. To do the right thing. But instead, you did what men like you always do. He let the words sink in for a moment before tilting his head slightly, his gaze cold. And now, you're going to live with the consequences. Briggs swallowed, but his throat felt tight, constricted. The weight of those words settled into his chest, pressing down like an unseen force. Consequences. A concept he had never truly been forced to reckon with. Not until now. Ayanna took a step forward, and for the first time, Briggs stepped back. It was instinctive, reflexive, but the moment it happened, he knew, he had already lost. She studied him for a long moment, her dark eyes unreadable. "Tell me something, Officer Briggs," she said, her voice carrying none of the anger, none of the rage he might have expected. There was something far more unnerving about her calmness, about the quiet power in her presence. "When you put that uniform on every morning, when you looked in the mirror, did you ever ask yourself why you did what you did?" Briggs clenched his jaw, but the words stuck in his throat. Ayanna nodded slowly, as if she had expected the silence. "I think I know the answer. It wasn't about justice. It wasn't about the law. It wasn't about keeping people safe. It was about control." Her voice was low, deliberate, each word hitting its mark with quiet precision. "You needed people to be afraid of you. You needed them to know that you were the one in charge. But that's the thing about fear, Officer Briggs." Her head tilted slightly. "It only works until the people you're trying to control stop being afraid." Briggs exhaled sharply, his temper flaring despite himself. "You think you're some kind of hero? Some kind of martyr?" His voice was rough now, tinged with something that sounded dangerously close to desperation. "You think any of this changes the world? That people like me won't keep doing what we do?" He let out a dry, humorless laugh, shaking his head. "This is just a game to you, isn't it? You get to walk away from this with your head held high, and what? I go down for doing my damn job." His teeth clenched. "Well, congratulations. You got your little revenge story. But don't think for a second this is over." Ayanna held his gaze, steady and unwavering. "You're right," she said, her tone eerily soft. "It isn't over. But not for the reason you think." Briggs let out a slow breath, shaking his head again. "Oh yeah? And what exactly does that mean?" A new voice entered the conversation then, one that made the tension in the room grow even heavier. "It means you're not walking away from this with just a ruined reputation, Briggs." The voice belonged to another federal agent, stepping into the room, a file clutched in his hand. He was younger than Graves, but no less authoritative, his movements controlled, precise. He handed the file to Graves, who took it without a word, flipping it open with practiced ease. Briggs felt a fresh wave of unease crawl over his skin. "What the hell is this?" Graves barely glanced up. "Evidence." Briggs' stomach twisted. "Evidence of what?" The younger agent exhaled through his nose, his expression unreadable. "Of every single case you thought you buried. Every arrest you falsified. Every report you tampered with. Every time you stepped over the line and thought no one was looking." He paused for effect before adding, "We were looking, Briggs. We've been looking for a long time." The words hit him like a physical blow. His chest tightened, his pulse hammering against his skull. That's bullshit. You don't have anything on me. If you did, you'd have used it by now." Graves finally looked up, his gaze sharp enough to cut through steel. "We didn't need to rush. You were doing all the work for us." He slid the file across the table, right in front of Briggs. "Go ahead. Take a look." Briggs hesitated. And then, with slow, trembling hands, he flipped it open. His own face stared back at him, photographs, body cam footage, reports he thought had been destroyed, testimonies from people who had once been too afraid to speak. There was no way out of this. No cover-up, no lie that could undo what had already been exposed. His entire career was laid out in front of him, every misstep, every abuse of power, every crime he had committed under the guise of the law. His breath came short, shallow. "This isn't," Graves cut him off. "You're done, Briggs." The finality in his tone made the walls of the room feel smaller. The agent next to Graves nodded toward the two men standing by the door. "We're taking you into custody." Briggs' head snapped up, panic flashing in his eyes. "Wait, you had your chance," Ayanna said, her voice quiet, almost regretful. "You had so many chances." The agents moved toward him, but Briggs stepped back, his hands raised defensively. His breath came in short bursts now, his mind racing in circles, trying to find a way, any way, out of this. But there was none. For the first time in his life, there was no power left for him to hold on to. His hands trembled as the handcuffs clicked around his wrists. He had spent years putting people in chains. Now, he was the one wearing them. And there, standing in front of him, was the woman he had tried to break, the woman he had humiliated in front of an entire courtroom, the woman who had endured every second of his cruelty without ever once lowering her head. But now, he was the one looking up at her. Briggs could feel the unrelenting pressure of the cold steel against his wrists, the handcuffs digging into his skin in a way he had made others endure countless times before. It was an insignificant detail in the grand scheme of what was happening, but to him, it was everything. The sensation was foreign, jarring, a reality he had never once considered he would experience himself. Every click of the cuffs, every subtle shift in their position, was a suffocating reminder that his authority was gone. His mind raced, heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. This was wrong. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. He was the one who issued orders, who controlled the narrative, who dictated the terms. He wasn't supposed to be the one shuffled out of a courtroom in disgrace, wasn't supposed to be the one with flashbulbs capturing his every move, wasn't supposed to be the center of a scandal so massive it was already flooding news stations and social media feeds in real time. His breathing was uneven, too shallow, too fast. His whole body tensed, his instincts screaming at him to do something, anything, to regain control. But how? He had spent years playing this game, maneuvering within the system, bending it to his will, exploiting its cracks to ensure he always came out on top. And yet, here he was, trapped in a moment he couldn't twist, in a reality that was no longer his to manipulate. His eyes darted desperately between the faces surrounding him, federal agents, journalists, onlookers who had come to witness the downfall of a man who once believed he was untouchable. But the face that held him in place, the one that stole the air from his lungs, was Ayanna Parker. She stood at the threshold, watching as the world swallowed him whole. She wasn't triumphant, wasn't mocking him, wasn't reveling in his destruction the way he might have if their roles had been reversed. No, there was something far more calculated, more precise, more devastating about the way she simply existed in this moment, in this space, in this power that had always been denied to people like her. His throat felt like sandpaper as he forced out the words, his voice cracking under the weight of his desperation. You don't have to do this." His breath hitched as he took a step forward, only to be yanked back by the agents at his sides, their grips firm, unyielding. His pulse spiked, panic clawing at his chest. "Listen to me. We can work something out." His voice rose, losing the confidence it had once carried, cracking apart at the seams. "I can cooperate. I'll talk. I'll tell you everything I know." He tried to step forward again, but the cuff stopped him, a hard, jarring reminder that he wasn't in control anymore. Just take these off, and let's talk." Graves barely glanced at him, his face impassive. "You had your chance to talk. You had years of chances." His voice was even, deliberate, unshakable. "And every single time, you made your choice." Briggs' hands balled into fists, the cuffs rattling slightly as he struggled to steady himself. His breathing was still too fast, his head light from the rapid intake of air. "You don't get it," he ground out, his voice teetering on the edge of rage and fear. You don't know what it's like to be in my position. The pressure, the decisions we have to make every single day." Ayanna's voice cut through the air like a blade. "You think you're the only one who's ever felt pressure?" Her words were quiet, but they carried more weight than anything he had said in his entire life. "You think the people you pushed around weren't living under pressure every single day? You think the people you arrested, humiliated, locked up, didn't have to make impossible choices just to survive?" Her head tilted slightly, her gaze locking onto his with an intensity that sent ice crawling up his spine. "You're not a victim, Briggs. You're just a man who got caught." His jaw clenched so hard it ached. He shook his head, grasping at anything to hold on to, anything to twist this in his favor. "You think you're some kind of hero? You think this is justice?" He let out a sharp, humorless laugh, but it came out hollow, lacking the confidence he had always carried. "You got your little revenge story, congratulations. But don't fool yourself. This doesn't change anything. People like me will keep doing what we do, and people like you will always be beneath us." Ayanna stepped forward again, closing the space between them, and for the first time in his life, Briggs stepped back. It was small, almost imperceptible, but the moment it happened, they both knew it, he had already lost. She studied him for a long moment before speaking again, her voice softer now, but no less dangerous. "You're right," she said, tilting her head slightly. "This doesn't change everything. Not yet. But it changes you." Briggs stiffened, his whole body going rigid as her words settled in his chest like a stone. "This moment," she continued, taking her time, letting every syllable sink in, "is going to follow you for the rest of your life. Every headline, every interview, every time someone looks at you in the streets, you won't be Officer Briggs anymore. You'll be the cop who got caught." His pulse spiked, the air in his lungs thinning. "This isn't right," he muttered, shaking his head violently, the panic clawing its way back to the surface. You can't do this to me." His voice cracked, his composure slipping further. "I have a family. A life. What am I supposed to do?" Ayanna's expression didn't change, didn't soften, didn't offer the mercy he had never given to others. "Maybe you should have thought about that before you destroyed other people's lives." The words hit him harder than any physical blow ever could. His breath shuddered, his vision blurring at the edges. Graves finally gave a small nod to the agents. "Take him out." Briggs' eyes widened, panic surging through his veins like fire. "Wait." His body tensed as the agents tightened their grip, as the cuffs dug deeper into his wrists. "This isn't over. You hear me?" His voice rose in pitch, trembling now. "This isn't over." The door opened. And Briggs saw them. Reporters. Cameras. News crews. A sea of flashing lights and microphones. His name was already burned into every headline. His face plastered across every screen. His fall from grace immortalized in real time, broadcasted to every corner of the country. The disgraced officer, paraded in front of the world just as he had once paraded his victims. His downfall was public, irreversible, inescapable. And standing there, just beyond the threshold, watching as justice finally took its course, was Ayanna Parker. She didn't smile. Didn't gloat. Didn't need to. Because she had already won. The air outside the courthouse was electric, charged with an intensity that Briggs had never felt before, never expected to feel on this side of the law. He had walked these steps so many times, his boots hitting the pavement with the confidence of a man who believed he owned the very ground he stood on. But now, every step felt heavy, like chains were dragging him forward, pulling him toward a fate he could no longer escape. The weight of the cuffs, the firm grips of the federal agents at his sides, the sea of reporters screaming his name, cameras flashing so fast they turned the evening into a pulsing strobe of humiliation, it was all suffocating, unbearable, a nightmare that refused to end. His breathing was shallow, erratic, as the reality of what was happening truly began to settle in his chest, pressing against his ribs like a vice. He wasn't going back to his precinct. He wasn't going home. He wasn't going to talk his way out of this like he had so many times before. This time, there was no escape. The crowd outside the courthouse was larger than he had expected, larger than he had ever seen for a case like this. People weren't just watching from behind the barriers, they were waiting, anticipating, eyes locked onto him with expressions ranging from disgust to vindication. Some held signs with his name scrawled in bold letters, some with the word justice written across them like a promise. Others had their phones raised, capturing every second of his fall from grace, broadcasting it live to the world. He could already imagine the headlines, the comments sections, the endless discussions tearing him apart, dissecting his actions, his past, his name. For the first time in his life, Briggs understood what it felt like to be the one under scrutiny, to be the one whose name was being used as a cautionary tale. But the worst part? The worst part was that she was watching too. Ayanna Parker stood just beyond the chaos, separate from the flashing lights and the shouting reporters, but her presence was unmistakable. Her posture was calm, controlled, her hands resting in the pockets of her coat as she observed the scene in front of her, as she observed him. There was no satisfaction on her face, no trace of smugness or gloating. That, somehow, made it worse. Briggs felt his throat tighten, a raw, unfamiliar shame crawling up his spine. He wanted to look away, wanted to break the eye contact, but he couldn't. His voice came out hoarse, barely audible over the noise around them. "Is this what you wanted?" Ayanna held his gaze for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice was steady, deliberate. "What I wanted." Her head tilted slightly, as if she were studying him now, as if she were trying to see something beneath all that panic, all that desperation. "What I wanted was to exist without people like you deciding I didn't deserve to." Briggs' chest tightened, the words cutting through him like ice. "I didn't," he stopped, his breath catching. "I was just doing my job." Her expression didn't change, but something in her eyes shifted. "That's the part you never understood, isn't it?" Her voice was quieter now, but it carried more weight than the deafening crowd behind them. "You thought your job was to enforce control, not justice. To punish people for stepping outside the lines you drew, not to protect them." She shook her head slightly, her gaze sharp as glass. "You never saw us as people, Briggs. You saw us as problems to be dealt with. And now, for the first time, you're feeling what it's like to be treated the same way." Briggs clenched his jaw, his hands balling into fists despite the cuffs. "You think this makes you any different from me? You're standing there watching me fall, and you're enjoying it just like I would have if our roles were reversed." Ayanna exhaled slowly, her shoulders rising and falling with measured control. "You still don't get it." Briggs let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Then help me get it, Parker. Tell me how I'm supposed to see it. Because from where I'm standing, all I see is a world that still works the same way, it just found a new villain to put on trial." His voice turned sharp, desperate now, clawing for something, anything to make sense of the chaos unraveling around him. "What happens after this? What changes? You think they won't just find another cop, another face to plaster on the news, another name to crucify? You think this is some kind of victory?" Ayanna studied him for a long moment, and then, to his surprise, she nodded. "You're right." Briggs blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected agreement. "You're right," she repeated, her voice firm. "The system won't change overnight. There will be others like you, more cases, more headlines. More people who abuse power and think they'll get away with it." She took a slow step forward, lowering her voice just enough that only he could hear her. "But this? This moment? This is a victory. Because for the first time, the world is watching. And you're not walking away from this like all the others before you did." Briggs' breath hitched, the weight of those words settling like a stone in his chest. Because deep down, he knew she was right. He could fight, he could deny, he could curse the system all he wanted. But he wasn't walking away from this. The agents gave a sharp tug on his arms, guiding him toward the waiting car, but as he was pulled forward, his eyes never left hers. And Ayanna, standing there, watching him as the world finally held him accountable, didn't move. She didn't need to. Justice had already spoken. The courtroom that had once been filled with laughter and quiet approval at Ayanna's humiliation now stood as a monument to a man's downfall. The world had shifted. The people who had once dismissed her as nothing had witnessed the impossible. Officer Daniel Briggs stripped of everything he thought would protect him. The badge that had once been his shield was now nothing more than a relic of a man who thought himself untouchable. Briggs was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, with additional civil suits mounting against him from those he had wrongfully arrested, harassed, and brutalized. His name became a cautionary tale, a reminder that even those who wield power carelessly can one day find themselves on the other side of the law. His fall from grace was absolute. In prison, there were no more cameras to play to, no more uniforms to hide behind, no more people to intimidate. He was just another man behind bars, facing the same reality he had condemned others to for years. And the worst part? He had to live with the fact that Ayanna Parker had walked away while he rotted in a cell. Ayanna, however, was no longer just a woman who had been humiliated in a courtroom. She was no longer a face people ignored, another statistic lost in the system. She was the woman who took down a corrupt cop without ever raising her voice, without ever needing to lower herself to his level. Her name spread across the country, but not in the way Briggs had. Hers was spoken with admiration, with respect, with power. She wasn't homeless anymore. The agency had never truly abandoned her, and though her assignment had ended, her mission had just begun. She didn't disappear back into the bureaucracy of intelligence work. Instead, she took the platform that had been given to her, one she had earned through fire and humiliation, and used it. She became a voice for those who had been silenced, an advocate for those Briggs and men like him had stepped on for years. It wasn't revenge. It was justice. She walked the same streets where she had once been invisible, but now, people saw her. They nodded in recognition, in understanding. Some thanked her. Some told her their own stories. Some just watched from a distance, seeing in her the possibility that one day, justice might reach them too. And the courtroom where she had once stood, shaved and humiliated, became the very place where new cases against corrupt officers were tried. Her case had set a precedent. And Briggs was just the beginning. But here's the real question, was justice truly served? Some might say yes. That Briggs got what he deserved, that the system worked for once. Others might argue that the system is still broken, that one fallen officer doesn't erase years of abuse, decades of unchecked power, centuries of oppression. And maybe they're right. But here's what you should ask yourself, how many people like Ayanna have been buried in silence? How many people like Briggs have walked away without consequences? How many stories just like this one have never been told? This time, the world watched. This time, justice came for the man who thought himself untouchable. But how many more are still out there? And when the next Ayanna Parker steps forward, will we listen? If this story made you think, if it made you feel something, don't just move on. Share your thoughts in the comments. Let's talk about it. Let's ask the hard questions. And if you want more stories like this, stories that make you feel, make you question, make you see the world just a little differently, subscribe to Tales of Twist. Because sometimes, justice comes with a twist you never saw coming.